Welcome back, everybody. In our previous lecture, we spent some time introducing everybody to the general overview of the class. We talked about how the class was going to be structured, how students were going to be graded in the class, and it provided a few tips and reminders about how to progress through the class in the most optimal way. Well, in today's lecture, what we're going to be doing is transitioning our attention to just what psychology is all about in the first place. We're going to start when talking about psychology by looking at how this as a field developed. As we progress, we'll look at current approaches to psychology and some of the things that you might look into if you decide to pursue some type of a career or degree within the field. But let's first, as I mentioned, start off with where psychology came from in the first place. If we want to understand where psychology came from, we have to first appreciate that this area of research, this field, is relatively new in comparison to a lot of our other older sciences that we have. Historically, if we're looking at where psychologists came from, what most people tend to argue is that psychology was really the offspring of a merger between two very important areas of interest for many centuries, philosophy and biology. What many early psychologists attempted to do was understand ways to scientifically study some of the classic philosophical problems that had been posed for many centuries. One of the classic questions that early psychologists attempted to try to scientifically understand was something called the mind-body problem. Nowadays we sometimes even call it the mind-body-brain problem, giving recognition to the fact that our brain is a critical player in lots of different components of our mind. Now, this mind-body question asks whether or not the mind is a separate entity from the body, or really the mind is just a byproduct of structural or cellular activity that really can be whittled down to just simply that. This was, again, something philosophical people had tried to answer for many centuries. If you look back into the history of the Greeks and Romans, you can even see many people writing and debating different ways to try to attack this problem. But as biology started to rise and people started to develop scientific approaches to studying things, psychologists, or people who started calling themselves psychologists, decided to try to tackle this problem in some form of a scientific way. This was also true for another very common debate that was happening long before psychology existed, something called the free will versus determinism debate. The question of whether or not we actually are the ones driving the ship or the ones just being driven by the environment around us. This question of whether or not we are the conveyors of our mind and our actions is still something that many people ask today. But if we look at today's psychologists trying to study this, what we see is a lot of them using formulas and talking about ratios instead of looking at this as the classic dichotomy that many philosophical individuals tried to treat it as for many centuries. Many psychologists today who call themselves personality psychologists or social psychologists or even cognitive psychologists really try to tease out all the components at play that can help us understand why we do some of the things that we do. And as we've transitioned into psychology away from these philosophical backgrounds and even into some more biological ones, we really have tried to parse out all the different components within the brain, within the body, and within the environment that are always at play in our everyday actions. And this brings us to another really important topic that early psychologists wanted to address, this question of nature versus nurture. As we change, as we develop, as individual differences start to emerge, whether or not these things are a byproduct of biological inheritance, inevitability, or whether or not they're a byproduct of the environment has been a big debate. And much like this free will versus determinism debate that we talked about previously, many of today's psychologists don't treat this concept or this question now as a dichotomy. Instead, they look at ratios and about of something that could be attributed to nowadays what we consider genetics or biological inheritance. And we also look at the environmental factors, things that are either shared or unshared, that are also playing a very critical role in the development of specific characteristics. All of these questions, and many more, were again the major roots of the development of psychology in the mid to late 1800s, and eventually spurred on researchers, people who started to call themselves psychologists, to find ways to develop measurements and tools so they could really become the scientific individuals they endeavored to become. And if we look back in time, the early development of psychology, many historians and psychologists that like to study the development of the field love to credit one particular individual for allowing psychology to take its first major step into the scientific world. It's the gentleman pictured there on the right, named Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt, in the late 1800s, was very interested in just the basic properties of the mind. He was convinced that if we could find ways to establish measures that let us look at things like reaction time and perception and the ability to have our mind communicate with our body, we could open the door to looking at other, more complex mechanisms of the mind later on. And to do this, he established a very broad-reaching psychological laboratory in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. Wundt's lab can still be seen if you want to go tour random things around the world, and it's hailed as this breakthrough moment in psychology where somebody found a way to study certain principles, properties of the mind that until then were only things that people really tried to debate. But it's important to note that when we look at Wundt's lab, it was extremely limited in the scope of psychological concepts it looked at. It certainly wasn't studying some of the complex concepts of memory, emotions, attention, things that we think of as critical components to psychology today. Instead, it was really just trying to break down some of the most simple principles of the mind so we could understand this particular set of ideas in a scientific realm. He was sort of trying to just show us that we could be scientists studying the mind. It didn't just have to be something we debated or something we threw our hands up and argued we could never scientifically quantify like biologists, chemists, or physicists already were doing in their work. And there were, if we're giving Wundt credit, some things that he discovered within this lab that still have certain levels of utility. One of my favorite examples of something that he discovered was this sort of disconnect between when we were processing auditory information and when we expected to process auditory information. His lab found that when we watched something occur, when we saw something happen and we were anticipating a sound to come out, our reactions, or I guess our minds, expected sounds to precede the events just a little bit before they actually happen. This led to him talking about this millisecond difference, or a couple milliseconds difference, between when a sound should be presented in, say, a film or some story versus when it actually occurred. Many cartoons and other individuals like Walt Disney rediscovered this particular fact that Wundt had talked about in the late 1800s when they started creating their own movies and films, trying to show action scenes where different things like balls would bounce off of heads and make funny sounds. What Disney and many other people creating these films showed was that if you had the sound actually precede the event just a fraction of a second, it seemed more aligned, more in sync with what was actually going on. Again, not necessarily something that Wundt was intending to explore with his research, but his attempts to just understand basic principles of the mind did have a lot of utility, and again, it set the framework for lots of future researchers to find their own paths to studying different aspects of the mind. One particular individual that picked up the torch of Wilhelm Wundt was one of his students named Edward Titchener. Titchener actually studied under Wundt for many years at his psychological lab, and eventually became one of the first major researchers who had earned their PhD to travel to the United States and begin teaching concepts of psychology. Titchener has been tied to a lot of different topics and ideas over the years, but one of the ideas that has been a big component to his career and really did shift the conversation in psychology in a way that he saw fit was his notion of something called structuralism. This attempt to sort of parse out all the different components in the environment that were playing a role in our experience, our recognition of a situation as a whole. A classic example of how structuralism works can be highlighted in a technique he used in a lot of his study called introspection, where he would have individuals experience a fairly basic stimulus and ask them to break down what it was from that experience that allowed them to make sense of what they were encountering. Say, for example, I plopped an orange in front of you, like the one you see pictured in the upper right-hand corner. What a structuralist would do is ask an individual to look at that orange and try to break down all the different things that made that orange be perceived as an orange, and then try to break down what was the most critical components within it that really allowed you to perceive it in that way. For example, if I took away the stem, would you still see that object as an orange? What if I took away the pock marks within the orange? Would you still see it as an orange? What if I colored it yellow? Or what if I took some of the gleam off of that orange? At what point would you no longer be perceiving that object as an orange? And to what extent are people maybe getting this identification incorrect as I took more and more parts away? What Titchener believed was that by doing this, by breaking down all of these basic principles into their different components, we could get insights into how the mind was organized. Now, it's important to note that Titchener, even though he was considered a champion of this idea, was not one of the original developers of this introspection technique. It's actually something that Wundt had used in his lab, and Titchener just carried with him to the States as he started to push his own research and try to promote this development of psychology across the United States. With time, Titchener was very successful. Many schools started to develop degrees in psychology. Many programs across Europe started sending very famous researchers to the United States to really promote the values of psychology and how to be scientific in the endeavors of starting to study the mind. And this led to sort of a small upswell in this profession in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But it's important to note that we hadn't really, even in the late 1800s, established what psychology was as a whole. We'd had some people tinkering with things to study, but nothing had really been defined and categorized the same way a lot of the other sciences had. And this leads us to the next big component or person that's critical in the development of psychology. And this individual was a researcher / theorist named William James. Now, technically, if we look at James' technique and approach and try to kind of compare it to Titchener's, many people would argue that James was seen as a functionalist. What this means was he's very interested in not necessarily breaking down the single individual components that made up our experiences, but why we had different aspects of the mind in the first place. One of the best quotes that I could find from James is the ones you see listed here. Don't concern yourselves with the parts and structures of the mind and brain. Instead ask, what is the purpose behind our mind's actions? So for, say, example, memory, we don't want to, in James's functionalist approach, break down all the different types of memory that exist, like we will do later on in the class. Instead, understand the utility of memory in the first place. Why different aspects of memory exist and what their value is in the human experience. As he tried to adopt this functionalist approach, he also sought out to define what psychology was as a whole. And this eventually led him, in 1890, to publish one of the most celebrated books in psychology, a book entitled The Principles of Psychology, which attempted to lay out all the different areas of psychology that existed through the research that was being conducted, and sort of give us a roadmap as to what else we should study if psychology wanted to become a budding science like a lot of the other sciences that existed at the time. He also, in this book, tried to lay out different approaches to research that were being done and could be conducted by people within the field. If you look at this book, try to read through it, you will quickly identify that it's a little difficult to read. It's nearly 1,000 pages long, filled with lots of phrasing and terminology and ideas that are sort of not used in psychology today or even our everyday discussions. But his work, though it was very rudimentary and very simplistic in comparison to our work today, really did provide us with the first roadmap that psychologists used for many decades after to understand what psychology could be, how people could be categorized into different types of psychologists, and theoretically, what needed to be answered in this quest to make psychology a hard science. And after James's book became very popular, well, popular is a sort of ambiguous term here, what we saw was growth, not only in this expansion of psychology, but the diversification of different topics that psychologists started to explore. And James's notoriety was paired up with the kind of upswell in another thing that theoretically shifted the field of psychology for almost, well, at this point, centuries. And this was the work of a very famous, but also highly controversial individual within the field of psychology named Sigmund Freud. Many of you have probably heard of Sigmund Freud long before you got into an introduction to psychology class. Some of the terms and ideas that he promoted in the late 1800s and early 1900s became part of our common culture. And at that time, as James was publishing his book, Freud was gaining notoriety by trying to explore hidden aspects of the mind that he argued were relatively dirty and kind of negative, but interesting and what many people described as sexy. In the late 1800s, he started publishing books, building up his own psychodynamic institute in Vienna, Austria. And eventually, in 1900, he published one of the most famous books still today in psychology, entitled The Interpretation of Dreams. Now, this book, The Interpretation of Dreams, pales in comparison in terms of content and breadth as James's Principles of Psychology book did. It still became much more popular than James's book, at least outside of the field of psychology, because of how intriguing a lot of the things he discussed were. In the book, he talked about different symbols and elements of our dreams that could give us insights into the different aspects of our mind and really break down some of the individual differences that we saw. His approach to studying these things could potentially be described as psychological because he theoretically, as we'll talk about when we actually have a whole class on him, were based on some type of research, even though it's highly disputed as to how much research Freud was doing. But it definitely did not meet the academic rigor that many of Freud's colleagues were engaging in. And this made him a very controversial person even at the time of his meteoric rise. And his pairing with psychology led to this huge rise in the field as a whole. Many individuals do identify and recognize that Freud was a critical player in the growth of psychology. Many colleges started offering psychology classes and different things relating to psychology that people could discuss as a byproduct of the growth and popularity in psychology that came from Freud's publications. but they also loathed the fact that these growths, these rises, were byproducts of somebody who wasn't following the traditional rules that many early psychologists had set. And they were a byproduct of somebody whose view on human experience, the mind as a whole, was inherently negative. And this push and pull that came from Freud for actually many decades eventually evolved into sort of a schism within the field, a break from those who wanted to study more popular, interesting ideas in pseudoscientific ways, and those that wanted to hold firm to our original research-based approaches to understanding the mind. Eventually, the big counter to Freud that rose up was something called the behavioral movement. This behavioral movement, which started in the 1920s, was not only a direct reaction to Freud, but a natural evolution of many of the different things that early psychologists were studying. Freud's insistence that the mind was extremely vast and that there were lots of components to it that just couldn't be studied scientifically not only rubbed lots of psychologists wrong, but it was something that flew in the face of a lot of early psychologist beliefs, that if we studied basic principles of the mind, we could eventually build on research, on ideas, and get a more complete understanding of the mind as a whole through that scientific lens. Behaviorism, which focused a lot on learning, how we reacted to observable environmental things in observable ways, was seen again as the natural progression of a lot of the early sensation and perception work that we talked about earlier, stuff that was championed by Titchener, by even Wundt himself, and other psychologists that we don't have time to talk about in a class like this. And it really was not only an attempt to bring psychology back to a scientific realm, but something, as we're going to see in this class as we develop and talk about different areas, kind of a natural consequence of the path that psychology was on. And behaviorism sort of became, I think, a little bit more militant as a byproduct of its not only attempts to just explain how the mind worked in the same scientific way that we were looking at before Freud, but it stayed on that steadfast route for a long time in direct reaction to the celebrations of Freud and his attempts to understand the mind in his significantly less than scientific way. And this growth in behaviorism, this focus by many people that called themselves psychologists for many decades, lasted for a long time. And so we continued to constantly run into problem after problem in our attempts to use behaviorism as the only tool to understand how humans behaved in the world around them and animals alike. This eventually led to another big break, or not necessarily break, but shift within the field. And this shift, though it started in the 1960s, eventually got a name in the early 1970s called the Cognitive Revolution, where researchers who were trying to hold true to the behavioral ideas and really approaches to studying the mind kept finding that the behavioral mechanisms and laws being used simply couldn't explain multiple aspects of the mind. Motivation and persistence, two things that were sort of taboo within behaviorism, seemed to play roles in lots of the actions that people committed and couldn't be whittled down to just observable things. This was also true in another very popular topic being studied in the early 1900s of memory. We not only could see that different aspects of memory couldn't be whittled down in behavioral terms, but the way memory could easily be distorted, how certain things were more memorable than others, was really tough for behaviorists to tackle. And it was an enticing topic that led many psychologists away from trying to just use the behavioral principles that we were incorporating into our research. Add that to the fact that clinical psychology was growing rapidly in the 1960s and 70s in a way that went beyond the work of Freud, yet still needed academic rigor, and we had a trio of reasons for people to, even who were very scientific in their approaches, to want to break from this traditional behavioral approach. What also encouraged people to do this was the fact that people were finding new ways to overtly study actions of the minds by the time we got to the 1960s and 70s. Tools that we'll be talking about in our next module of EEGs and fMRIs and PET scans became not necessarily commonplace, but available to people wanting to understand the mind. And it opened new doors and avenues that gave people alternatives to just looking at overt things to try to study psychology in the same scientific way it had for almost a century at that point in time. And this cognitive revolution eventually led to this blossoming of the field, where lots of different areas of interest started to be studied, but studied with the same scientific rigor that early psychologists had used, just, well, in different forms now at this point. And this leads us to, well, where we are today. And to understand what psychologists look at today, I thought I'd ask you three kind of odd questions. The first question is, if somebody told you they were a psychology major today, what do you think that would mean? Do you have a specific person in mind when you think of somebody who pursues a psychology major? Do you have a specific profession in mind when you hear somebody earn their psychology degree? And if you think of psychology as multifaceted, what areas do you think are out there for psychologists? If you've got a chance, pause me for a minute. Think about this. Reflect on what you think psychologists are all about. And then I'll try to give you a roadmap to kind of how psychology has evolved over the course of the century and a half that it's been around. All right. Hopefully you had a chance to pause me there. Now that we're back, I thought maybe when we start defining all the different branches of psychology, it would be best to go back to what the definition of psychology is and was the entire time this has been a science. For over a century, the definition of psychology has been the scientific study of the human mind and behavior. Now, we've expanded a little bit, and we tend to say it's a scientific study of human mind and its functions nowadays, since that kind of expands the definition a little bit. But there's still a big focus on how our actions, overt behaviors, come about in different contexts, even though we've moved beyond behaviorism. And when we look at all the different branches of psychology, there's often some nuance of trying to understand the mind in this way, yet through different angles or different lenses that people can use to try to understand the multitude of complexities that do exist within our human mind and, well, all the mental functions that we exhibit. So how can we study the function of the mind? Well, if we want to break it down into its most simple parts, people can study functioning of the mind at the cellular level. I guess technically we could even go smaller. We could study it at the atomic level if we want to get really small, but most individuals, when they want to simplify studying the mind as much as possible, tend to focus on specific cells that we have throughout our body, which we'll talk about in the next class, called neurons. If that's not enough, or it's just not getting at the whole picture, but people still want to focus on biology, others can study different components of the mind by looking at structures within our what we call nervous system. They can study specific pathways, bands, or huge areas like lobes or parts of the brain. If that's not what somebody wants to study, they can expand a little bit more and focus their attention not on the structures within the body of the mind, but this person as a whole. They could study what we call the triad of the mind, where we look at either thoughts, emotions, or motivations, or some combination of these things. The three components that many psychologists argue are behind almost every action that we commit. Or we could look at the environment itself and how it's shaping the behaviors of an individual. We can look at overall environments, structures, things that are happening, or we can look at specific events and how they shaped large individuals, or large amounts of individuals, in their behaviors. And if we want to take even a further step back, we can talk about how societal standards, whole cultures, shift large numbers of individuals in either subtle or large ways. Essentially, what we can do is focus in or expand out in our scope of what we want to look at, to understand that whatever it is we're interested in looking at, and there's a lot that we can be interested in looking at. What many people have done, because there's so much that we're interested in looking at, is broken up psychology into major categories. And within those major categories, subcategories, specific topics that we find interesting. Historically, psychology has been broken up into 4 or 5 major branches. You've got social personality, you've got cognitive psychology, you've got developmental psychology, and clinical psychology. But within these, they can be broken down even more. Cognitive psychology can be split off into mental processes and neuroscience. Developmental psychology can be broken off into studying change and development, or studying heritability and different components of the biological interaction between the person and environment. Social psychology can be broken down into lots of different applications, and it can be separated away from personality psychology. In essence, much like we can look at the things affecting us at either a micro level or a macro level, we can do this in the specific topics, the areas that we want to study. And what this has led to is a diversification of psychology, where many people, when they start talking about being interested in psychology, they first have to learn the basics, and then they have to start carving out a path. Usually what they do is get an undergraduate degree within the field, specialize in specific classes, specific areas that they're interested in, so they can work their way to a specific type of career, a path that they want to take, and just figure out how to get from that undergraduate degree to that path, because oftentimes there's lots of extra steps that need to be taken along the way before many people who call themselves psychologists are at a finish line. And this brings me to a really important question that I want you to think about. If you're interested in getting into psychology, which I encourage you to do because it's an amazing field, you have to ask, how long do I have to wait before I do something related to psychology? If you want to become a clinical psychologist, or if you want to study development, or if you want to understand different parts of the brain and the body, when you get to do that, well, many people interested in psychology do tend to major in psychology. Maybe with another major or a minor paired up with it that's really appropriate, or not necessarily appropriate, but accommodates it well. And that's a great start. You can theoretically get jobs and get into careers that have something to do with psychology, if not maybe loosely, if you just get your bachelor's degree. But what most people tend to find is a lot of the professions that they aspire to get into require more than just a bachelor's degree these days. Some requires a master's, where you have to really work on perfecting a specific craft for 2 to 3 years. And this could be in some specialty area like IO Psych or ergonomics, or looking at human behavior in specific areas, or the clinical route where you get a master's in counseling. Or you could go the more research-based route of earning a PhD, or technically a PsyD, even though PsyDs are becoming more and more rare these days. PhDs often require varying degrees of research, but some type of research and some type of training to either get into education, therapy, or something else that's very particular for the specific PhD that you're pursuing. And it's important to note that when we talk about PhDs, there are a wide array of different types of PhDs that exist out there. Some are training people through lots of research to become researchers or to become professors or something else. Others are training individuals through lots of practice-based approaches and lots of internships and other things that are critical to get a PhD to become professionals in a specific area, like clinical psychology. This type of route is not only common for many individuals pursuing psychology degrees, but necessary for a number of the specific psychology professions that people are interested in. And this brings us back to a pretty important point that I want you to take note of if we're talking about psychology and how it exists today. Since psychology is a very scientific endeavor, we're trying to understand many complexities of the human mind, it takes a lot of background and experience to become a true psychologist. Not only do you need numerous classes that cover different aspects of psychology as an undergraduate, but you should probably plot a course forward where you're going to be taking years and years of school even after finishing your undergraduate degree, so you can become that professional that maybe you're aspiring to be within the field. If you can get there, many people will find that journey is worth it. And this brings me to one last thing that I want to address as we're going through these different areas of psychology. It's why are you taking this class? My hope is that you're not thinking now that you're going to take this class and just become a psychologist after you're done. There's still lots of things that maybe you're considering when you're thinking about taking this class. Again, if you can pause me for a second and come back, that would be great. But I'm going to go over some things in the next slide that I think you should be considering as you're taking this class and what I'm aiming to give to you as you're progressing. So for me, as you're getting through this class, I tend to put people into two different categories. Those that are taking this class because they're thinking about psych as a major, and those that are taking this class just because it's a requirement or something they found interesting, but with no intention of pursuing a psychology degree. If you're thinking about pursuing a psychology degree, one of the important things you need to consider is that pursuing a psychology degree requires a lot of decisions. You have to decide if it's not only a good fit for you, but you also have to decide paths that you want to take. You have to think of which classes you want to pursue, which areas you want to train in, which specialties you really want to start to develop. So when you go to that next step of pursuing a career or graduate program, you're well trained in whatever it is that you want to pursue. Many schools these days offer psychology majors, but only the students that have a path forward, a plan, are the ones that tend to be successful with the psychology degrees that they earn. This brings me to another important point for all of you thinking about a psychology major. I want you to take this class, or this class is specifically designed, to help prepare you for some of those upper division classes that you'll be taking. There are going to be different components to this class. They're going to ask you to think critically about things, apply stuff that we're covering in real-world situations. And these tools that I'm asking you to develop in this class will become critical aspects of all the future psychology classes that you'll take. And if you can be successful as you navigate through a lot of these things in this class, you should find yourself well prepared for all the future classes that will ask significantly more of you in later semesters. And for those of you not thinking about taking psychology as a major, that is perfectly fine. I'm sure you have your own goals for why you're here in this class. And my guess is that many of you are here because you recognize that even if psychology is not a major you want to pursue, there's lots of applications in the things we're covering, not only in your careers or areas of interest that you want to look into, but in your own life as well. What we tend to find is a lot of the things that we cover in psychology, no matter your age, vocation, or area, have real-world applications for you immediately. And this can not only be informative, but it can also be, and this is critical, a pretty fun thing. Now, I'm not saying that every single lecture will be something that's riveting and you're going to be on the edge of your seat wanting to learn more and more every single time you turn on this recording. But my hope is that you'll glean a couple really fun things out of every topic we cover. You'll find immediate applications to those things that we're discussing, and it can keep you coming back and keep you learning and trying to digest as much as possible. Even this isn't necessarily something that we want to pursue as a major or something you want to take future classes on. Or as I'm saying this, I'm hoping all the intended majors are still listening to me and recognizing that these goals of learning and enjoying aren't just for non-majors. It's for everybody, hopefully, taking this class. There's a lot out of this, right? There's a lot you can get out of this that really is for everyone, regardless of what their goal originally was when they signed up for this class. And this brings me to one last bit that I want to cover before we close out. To get you through this journey, to give you a sense of how the field is developed and what areas are out there and what you could pursue, we're going to, again, in this class, have numerous lectures that are going to focus on specific branches of psychology, and ones that look not only at our current topics within the area, but discuss a historical perspective on them as well. And this will allow you, if you do pursue future psychology classes or just want to understand future things later on, give you the groundwork that you need to really have a base of understanding that's critical to appreciate how some of the current things within psychology are looked at. As I mentioned, we will look at current stuff just within a general context, because it's tough to look at what's happening today or at this moment and really give a true representation of all the different things that psychology studies. And I know it's interesting enough, so I'll try to, every now and then, pepper in some of those things just so you can see that psychology is indeed everywhere, and there are lots of real-world applications to everything we're covering here. All right, and that brings us theoretically to the end of this first lecture. Well, I guess second lecture. Hopefully now that we've gone through this, you have a better sense of what psychology is all about. You have a better sense of what we're going to try to tackle within this class, and you've taken your first steps into this kind of journey into the past of psychology and how the field developed as a whole. We got a lot more stops to go, a lot more fun things to cover, but at this point, it's time for your first write-up. So I encourage you to make sure you log on right away, look at the prompts for that first write-up, get started on those as soon as you can, so you can turn in the very first assignment that's as good as you could possibly make it. And then we can turn our attention in the next module to one of the really critical components of this mind-body problem that we talked about earlier, the tiny cells that we call neurons. And that's for our next lecture. So at this point, I'm going to bid you adieu, wish you the best, and say I hope to see you soon. Take care all.